You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Welcome back to Music Tectonics, where we go beneath the surface of music and tech. I'm your host, Dimitri Vitsa. I'm also the CEO and founder of Rock, Paper, Scissors, the PR firm that specializes in music innovation, music tech, and also the event director at the Music Tectonics Conference coming up October 25th through 27th, 2022 in Santa Monica, California. You know, if you listen to this podcast, you know that we love to talk to big thinkers, people who are kind of like expanding out from what everyone else is talking about, thinking about, and getting us going. So I'm super excited for our guest today. Jimmy Stone is the founder and managing partner of Alderbrook Companies. It's a consulting and early stage investment firm where Jimmy works with clients ranging from investors, entrepreneurs, and executives at startups, public companies, everything in between. They work to solve strategy and finance problems. They work with companies in several industries, but with a particular focus on media and music. That's why he's here. Previously, Jimmy was an investor at a long/short hedge fund, and prior to that, a private equity fund. Jimmy began his career as an investment banker at JP Morgan, getting lots of expertise here. He also has an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a BA from Williams College. Jimmy Stone, how you doing today?
I'm great, Dimitri. Thanks for having me on.
You're in New Orleans, eh?
I am. Born and raised in New Orleans. It's summer here, so it's getting a little warm and humid, but love the city. Great to be down here.
Yeah, and I think I came across you on LinkedIn. You have this Leveling Up Substack newsletter, which is super cool. Tell us real quick about that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So yeah, I started writing Leveling Up, I'd say maybe 2 years ago, kind of put it down last year because I was super busy and picked it back up again, publish an article once a month. It's mainly, it's about learning in public. I've seen a couple examples, guys like Packy McCormick and Not Boring. It's a way for me to learn, but it's also a way for me to meet new people, share ideas, get better. Hopefully folks find it entertaining and interesting. And yeah, that's kind of the background. I guess I should add, I focus mainly on media, startups, investing, but topics can vary.
I love it. I haven't ever said this publicly, but that publicly learning thing, that's what Music Tectonics podcast is for me too. So it's probably why I like your style so much.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to focus on transmedia, the concept of transmedia. One of your recent articles was specifically about prioritizing transmedia storytelling with music IP, and you used HYBE, the company HYBE, as a kind of case study for your framework for analysis and just diving into this. So let's kick it off with a basic question. What does transmedia mean and why does it interest you? I hadn't really thought about the term until I saw your article. I was like, why am I missing something here? So what does it mean and why are you engaging in the topic?
Yeah, for sure. So just to put it really simply, transmedia is telling stories across platforms. So to give you an example of what that means, if you think about the Marvel Universe and Spider-Man, it originated as a comic. And since then, it's been made into movies, games, TV shows, etc. So it's starting with an original IP in one format and moving it into other formats. But at the same time, if you're super into transmedia, you'd say it's not simply putting out content in new formats. It's also about telling new stories in new formats in a unified way. So an example there would be, if you're a Star Wars fan like I am, originated in films, but you're also seeing them telling new canonical. They're expanding the story of the whole universe with The Mandalorian, Boba Fett in a TV format. So that kind of gives you a sense for what it is. In terms of what interests me about it, I think the first and foremost thing is it's a mega theme we're seeing across media now. A lot of the large media companies like Disney, Warner Brothers are really focusing on expanding content that originates in one format into others. So taking films like we talked about or TV shows, Riot games, even games, and expanding it beyond into, vice versa, moving the game into a movie or a TV show, moving the TV show into a movie or game. And so trying to understand what works, what doesn't work is really interesting to me. I'm a curious person. And the other thing about the theme is best practice really hasn't, we'll talk more about this, but best practice really hasn't been figured out necessarily yet. And so I just find that really interesting to kind of be learning about the tip of the spear type trends. And then the other thing I'd say that interests me about it, and I really hadn't thought deeply about it until I wrote the article, is you've seen some examples of transmedia in music in the past, whether it's, the Beatles, documentary, video game, Spice Girls, and the movie Spice World. There's been examples of IP that originated with music brought in other formats, but you haven't necessarily, I would argue, seen a company who's clear-eyed in the vision of, hey, we want to take our music IP and build an organization that, tries to become the music version of Disney, and tell stories in various formats. So, I think it's just it's an interesting theme, and in music specifically, super interesting.
This is great. I'm having a blast. I am doing my public learning here, so I appreciate it, Jimmy. And just to, before we dive into some of the specifics from the article and where you went with that, where did you first hear about this concept of transmedia storytelling? I mean, as you say it, I'm like, well, duh. Yeah, you look at a Disney or a Marvel. We actually had Riot Games' Toa Dunn, the head of Riot Games Music, on the podcast, and he basically gave us a case study in this, but we didn't talk about transmedia a single time. I was just like, my mouth kind of open, just listening to him talk about these virtual artists that have spun off the game. And I was like, why are they doing that? This is crazy. But now all of a sudden I have some language to put around it. And now I'm going to, by the end of this conversation, I think have a framework. But that, obviously we've seen it, we've experienced it. And in fact, this draws to mind this book called The Experience Economy that I mention occasionally, that I really like, that talks about this idea that people shouldn't just be thinking about commodities, products, services, but experiences. Like what's the full like five senses experience that's possible. So I love it. But the concept itself, where did you first hear about it? Maybe the term transmedia storytelling, or just getting it into your head that it was a thing?
Yeah, no, 100%. So I'd say about a year ago, I had never heard about it either. I do a lot of work in the video gaming space as well. I work with a group of guys at Navic, so shout out to them. They do incredible research, and they do consulting projects as well. And we basically had seen a lot of Hollywood type IP, film, TV IP being introduced into games, and we're, just again curious, wanting to know kind of what's going on there. And so through that research, as I was digging through, came across an article by Matthew Ball, who you may be familiar with. If you're not, former head of Amazon Studios. He just published a book called Metaverse, so free plug for him. Just kind of he's a thought leader in the media space, and he's written a couple articles on transmedia, and that kind of experience of writing an article on IP being brought into games and transmedia was my first exposure to it. So that's how I came across it.
Awesome. So you wrote this particular article that we're talking about by diving into how HYBE, the label behind BTS, prioritizes this transmedia storytelling. And in it, you mentioned that you're not even a K-pop fan yourself.
You're right.
So why did you write the article about HYBE specifically?
Yeah, no. So it's funny, when I started researching the article, I didn't have transmedia in mind at all, like 0%. I was just super interested in HYBE. And that was for a few reasons. So even though I don't listen to K-pop regularly, I'm well aware of BTS and how successful they've been. And I respect the fact that, HYBE, originally Big Hit Entertainment, wasn't a household name even in Korea. And it was an amazing kind of what seemed like overnight. And I know they've been in business over a decade, but seemed quite an overnight success story. So that was one thing. The other was, along the lines of their success, they've had a number of noteworthy financial milestones. So they went public at a really high valuation a couple of years ago. They, announced a pretty big acquisition of Ithaca Holdings. I think it was last year, over $1 billion. And then the third thing was, I'd seen some articles published about the founder of HYBE, Bang Si-hyuk, and some of the, success of BTS, but I hadn't really seen much of a deep dive into strategy or how the business was performing. Being a Korean company may have had some impact on how much coverage they've gotten in the States in terms of like a business coverage. So I was just super interested in the business. And then through doing that research, there's one presentation they made on corporate branding where, they talk about their vision. It was when they were changing the name of the company from Big Hit to HYBE, they talk about their vision for the company. They talk about the org structure for the company. And when they showed the org structure, like I was like, my mouth was like wide open, like, oh my God, like it was literally the framework I'd written about the year before of transmedia applied to games. And I was like, I have to, this is now the angle for the article, because it was just so interesting. And I'd never seen it applied to music before. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the genesis. It wasn't, hey, like, I'm not a K-pop fan, but I want to write about transmedia. It was like, hey, I'm really interested in learning more about what this business is doing. And then, oh my goodness, this is a transmedia strategy.
I love that because I felt the same way about HYBE. It's sort of like you keep hearing about it and you're like, they're making big moves. They're accelerating this artist and this community of artists and fans and doing really cool stuff around fan engagement. They actually are an investor in a company that we discovered through this podcast, Fave, cool. which is a fan engagement company. And I met the founder of Fave through the podcast. She reached out to me and I encouraged her to apply to the Music Tectonics startup competition. She ended up winning. And then as a result of that, her investment started flowing in, including eventually this investment from HYBE as well. So I'm like, yeah. And now they're a PR client of ours too. So I'm like, cool. I actually didn't know that much either. So reading your article I love that you were able to like do that public learning, what you wanted to do for yourself was super helpful for me and hopefully helpful for our listeners. They'll probably go and read the article now as well. But let's dive further into transmedia storytelling. If our listeners are like me, they had their mind blown just a minute ago when you just started explaining this. Things started to come together. But since this may be the first time that they've heard the concept, why would an artist or a label or a company like this use this approach?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to bring up here. I think first, it can potentially allow you to capture more of your fans' attention, more of your users or fans' attention. And the way that works is basically if you're only have so many entertainment hours in a day, and I'm a fan and I spend 10% of my time with audio, 30% of my time with video games, et cetera, with the other formats. By having content across formats allows fans to spend more of my time with your content. So existing fans, more of their attention. So that's point one. I think the second point would be it would allow your fans that you don't already have find you based on where they spend time. So there's a lot of great research around demographics. So and how much different age groups spend with different media formats. Deloitte put out a study that showed Gen Z and millennials, so young people basically, are heavily focused on games, playing video games, whereas boomers and Gen X are heavily TV and film focused. So, if your audience caters to, boomers, Gen X, if you basically release content into a video game, there's potential that you could acquire new users through that. And then another piece would be it could allow for additional monetization. So depending upon which medium it is, there's different. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is different mediums monetize better than other mediums.
Mm-hmm. So more profitable.
For sure. So like there's a great Twitch study that shows that fans monetize 15 times more on spending time watching videos on Twitch than what they do on Spotify, listening to music on Spotify. And if you look at what HYBE's been able to do over the last 3 to 4 years, you've seen them really, really scale the revenue that they've been generating outside of traditional audio channels. There's also the dynamic of releasing new content into new channels, benefiting previous. So like if you release content into movies or TV or video games, there's a potential of that creating an uplift in your audio content. And then the last thing I would say is and this is kind of a nuanced one, but it's given how difficult it can be to execute a transmedia strategy, you have to have a lot of capital. You have to coordinate the storytelling. You potentially have partnerships. You have to have varied skills to kind of release content into new channels. It's an opportunity for larger record labels to potentially have a value add that's differentiated in the market. So you're seeing now with proliferation of software tools and companies providing financing, it's becoming, there's a shift towards artists having more control over their careers, which is a great thing. And from a larger record label's point of view, you want to be differentiated, and this is a potential way to do that, is to offer artists that want to be really, really big potentially, with a partner who can facilitate that. So that's
Whoa, that was just like a little masterclass there, a masterclass in why an artist or a label would want to take this approach. I mean, I love thinking about that, the fact that you're maybe picking up fans whose primary media platform is different than what you're used to using as an artist or a label. So you're picking them up, or you're picking up the existing fans, but at different times during the day when they wouldn't necessarily solely be engaged with music. I also, as you were talking about in terms of gaming, like pick up additional monetization opportunities, and also digging into like catalog, like past stuff that's released. Like a lot of times, in certain moments in the music industry, you see it's all about what's now. And then you're talking about gaming, but look at TikTok, right? And see these Fleetwood Mac and Running Up the Hill and all this stuff that's like been released decades ago that has a whole new life. It's like, wow, my retirement's going to be better than I thought it was going to be. So it's not just gaming, but also seeing those, multiple formats. Hey, we're going to take a quick break for an announcement. When we come back, I kind of want to flip that question on its head and talk about, so what does it take to be successful at that? We'll be right back. Whoa, the ideas are flying fast on this episode. If you want to follow up on anything we're talking about today, we've made it easy. Head over to musictectonics.com and find this episode on the podcast page. You'll see show notes full of links and a time-stamped roadmap of the conversation. We're not responsible for internet rabbit holes you tumble down in the process. Now, let's get back to the conversation. All right, we are back, and just before the break, we were just talking about why somebody would use this transmedia storytelling approach, but I want to flip it on its head and ask you, Jimmy, what are the primary characteristics of successful transmedia storytelling? So we talked about the benefits in a way, but how do you get there?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll talk through the framework that we break down in the article, but I think it's important to preface that with saying that executing transmedia is super difficult over time. It's something that the largest media companies in the world, like we mentioned, Disney, Warner Brothers, et cetera, are trying to achieve. And they've had mixed success. Disney at one point had an in-house video game studio that they shut down and started outsourcing, forming partnerships with other studios in 2016, I think that was. So this should be taken with a grain of salt, understanding that there are challenges and best practices still trying to be understood. And so the framework, there's 3 parts to the framework, and then there's some overarching considerations. So the first is characters, so telling engaging stories through great content. For HYBE, the way they've structured their business is everything starts with the label group. That's where the music IP comes from, that fans fall in love with. And one of the considerations that HYBE has to deal with going forward is how do they diversify that IP across artists? And you've already seen that, a big headline since the article was published where BTS said they were going to take a hiatus. So, HYBE's got to figure out, do we develop those artists internally? Obviously a very difficult thing to do. Billions of dollars are spent on A&R and development every year by major labels, but that's one avenue. The other, and what I expect them to do going forward is to pair that with additional acquisitions. They did the Ithaca acquisition, which came with Big Machine. I'd expect to see some more acquisitions. They have a lot of cash on the balance sheet in an effort to, beef up and diversify that IP portfolio. So telling engaging stories through great content, like but that's an important one and a really challenging one. The next is the next piece of the 3-part framework is convenience. So what is convenience? It's providing the right content at the right time in the right place. So it's knowing who your audience is, what they look like, how old are they male or female, and where do they spend the rest of their entertainment time outside of audio? Are they playing video games? Are they watching movies and film, etc.? It's also, so looking at what HYBE's done along these lines, they've got their services, their solutions division, which creates online concerts, TV shows, games, webtoons, web novels, NFTs, to meet fans where they are. And it requires a team that has varying skill sets, but it also requires a strong partnership team where they can find mutually beneficial partnerships that can help them leverage that, that great content that's created at the label group. The third piece of the framework of a successful strategy would be around community, which is kind of your group of super fans that feel connected to each other and the stories that you're telling by constantly engaging them, providing them the tools that allow this group of people that would be really upset if your content went away and to have continuous engagement. With HYBE specifically, they're unique. I mean, this is one of the most unique things about their business is they've developed a Weverse, which is their app, their mobile app and web platform that allows their fans to engage with each other, engage with the artists, to consume content, to purchase merchandise, to purchase subscriptions that has for gated content. It's this community tool that they've developed, and they've started onboarding third-party artists as well to the platform. So those are kind of the three pillars of a successful transmedia strategy, or how to execute a successful transmedia strategy.
So characters, convenience, community.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Yeah, 3 C's.
And then overarching that, which is we touched on a bit earlier, is coordination and capital. So, from a coordination standpoint, an example I love is Marvel Studios. So they've got a chief creative officer that oversees kind of their entire content universe, from books to comics to TVs and movies, and make sure that it's working in a synchronized way. And, as we talked about, HYBE structured their organization in a way to allow for a coordinated transmedia storytelling effort. And it also takes a lot of capital, right? I mean, to tell all these different stories, to roll out continuous content, to develop the tools necessary takes a lot of capital.
It'll be interesting to see if that takes a lot of capital part changes, because we're seeing more and more tools emerging for creators that, something that used to take a studio of hundreds of people, somebody's doing with an iPhone. Obviously, it's not the same end product yet, or maybe it never will be, but it does reduce the capital in a way. And maybe in some of these communities for different demographics are used to low budget content, right? That's actually part of the aesthetic goal, is to not make it too fancy and crazy.
For sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it just depends on your goals.
And you have a great little infographic in the article, which, by the way, you can find this article at jimmystone.substack.com. Is that the best URL to use?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Nothing fancy.
Yeah. And you grabbed an infographic from something called Conductor. Is that something you've referenced before? That was the first time I'd heard of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was literally through researching Transmedia. It's their framework that they've published, and I've used it in the prior piece on video games and Transmedia. And I think it's kind of like an easy to understand, pretty clear infographic.
Awesome. So definitely check that out. And speaking of demographics, you talked a little bit about being able to serve different future fans by being on a different platform, and also or serving your existing fans across different moments in the day or the week or the month or whatever. But talk to me about this relationship between transmedia storytelling and serving multiple demographics of audiences. I mean, it sounds, you mentioned the capital intensiveness. In a way, sometimes those different demographics are calling for totally different content, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there's a table in the piece where you can see this visually. I'll try to walk through it on
audio
the podcast, but on audio. But I'd recommend checking out the piece so you can see this. So Deloitte did a study where they break down where 4 different demographics: Generation Z, Millennials, Generation X, and Boomers spend their time. And I just pulled it up so that I know what I'm talking about. But basically, if you look at where Gen Z spends its time, it's primarily playing video games and listening to music. The youngest generation. I think that makes sense for people in podcasts who have kids. Millennials similarly are very video game and music and actually TV and movie focused, whereas Generation X and Boomers are mainly staying at home, watching TV and movies. Very few play video games. And so the idea is that kind of what we were talking about earlier, where if you're just releasing music, you're only capturing a certain percentage of whatever your demographic, your users, wherever they fit in the demographic spectrum's time. And so you can kind of focus in on where, if you have a specific demographic, you can focus in on where does that demographic spend the most time. So if for an example, maybe give it some meat, is, if most of your listeners are Gen Z and they're spending 14% of their time listening to music, well, maybe, if you're considering where should I release content next? Well, if they're spending the most time playing video games. So that probably is not a bad place to release some content. And kind of the thing to think about is to understand your audience. Where are they spending most of their entertainment hours? And, can you basically get more of their attention, potentially monetize more in various other entertainment formats.
Amazing. And it is a super cool kind of table you have in there from Deloitte. One thing that strikes me is that engage on social platforms. I always think about social platforms as also being split across demographics, Facebook versus Instagram versus Twitter versus Twitch versus
for sure.
Be Real versus LinkedIn. And
you can go a lot deeper for sure in the analysis.
Yeah. Everyone's like, oh, you got to be on TikTok. You got to be on TikTok. Yeah. Well, maybe. It depends, right? Yeah, super interesting. Sure. Great. Appreciate that. So you also talk in the article about some media formats being more lucrative than others, and you mentioned that at the top of the podcast. Has the music industry undervalued media formats that they considered peripheral to music, or is it something larger that's changing in consumer behavior that's making those other formats more valuable?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I didn't go super deep into this topic in the piece, so I don't have like a very clear view on this answer. I think it's a little bit of both. I think on the consumer behavior point, I think for sure fans are spending more time. I mean, we just walked through that table. Younger fans are spending much more time with digital content in new ways. So they're spending much more time in interactive experiences and video games. I think on the music undervaluing other formats point, I don't necessarily know if music's undervalued other formats. For sure that I don't think music's yet embraced this kind of transmedia strategy full bore, like you've seen maybe in other, in film, TV, or games. But I think, this is my view. Like I think music's struggled with monetizing super fans, and I think one thing transmedia strategy allows you to do is do that, like to really focus in on your fans and where they spend time. Really focusing on a community. So that's where I come out is transmedia kind of supports the relationship with your super fans, and it really stresses that. Yeah. And I think that's one thing that maybe music's kind of struggled with over time. That's my view.
Yeah. I mean, the other piece that I think about with it from this kind of music tech, music innovation side is that it's taken a long time for music to figure out the licensing issues as these new things emerge as well. So it's not necessarily that they're undervalued, but first they were burned by peer-to-peer sharing, by not getting ahead of that and figuring out how they were going to monetize that. And then, Apple iTunes kind of became this gorilla in the industry and kind of dictated a lot of the terms. And so they hesitantly moved into streaming. Now streaming has brought the revenue of the whole music economy up to a previous viable point, but in the process has forced everybody to sort of solve this licensing issue more. It's not totally solved. Attribution is still a challenge. Royalty payouts is still a challenge. Splits is a piece of this that makes all of that a mess. And also just managing the large increase of the amount of music that's getting released commercially, it just makes it an exponential data pipeline problem. But now that some of this stuff is starting to get sorted out, also getting rehashed again in the form of blockchain tracking and payouts and things like that. But as it's starting to kind of level out to some extent, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And I actually think that the streaming component was an important developmental stage in the music economy that is now a very strong foundation. And the type of thing that you're talking about, sure, there's transmedia doing multiple things at once, intense in capital, possibly not reachable by everyone that's listening to this podcast or every artist or label, but parts of it are. Like just diving into one piece of another platform, maybe following some of your advice about targeting a demographic accordingly, I think are possible because of that licensing. Anyway, Over the last couple of years, I think we've seen this, you mentioned superfans, this emergence of extreme fandom. And I know it's sometimes referred to as stans from the K-pop world and spreading westward. I don't know if the concept of this extreme fandom is spreading, or just we saw it kind of like it was kind of labeled and noticed in the East first, and now people are realizing, well, it's totally relevant, and we see it over here with Swifties or whatever else. But it's like a seismic shift, creating new forms of community, whether an artist or a game maker likes it or not. It's happening. They might, sometimes the fans are creating it. But how does community, one of the pillars you mentioned, this direct connection between an artist and their fans, how does that play into the transmedia strategy and HYBE in particular? If we could dive a little bit more into that.
Yeah. So, community, like I mentioned, like I've done a lot of work in gaming, specifically in crypto too. And it's this very buzzwordy thing that I think it's thrown around a lot. Like, what is community, right? I think of it like, and I think I mentioned this earlier, it's like your fans that would be like super upset if your IP went away. It's your super fans. And so from like a strategic business perspective, these are the people who have the lowest cost of acquisition. Like when you release new content, they also have the highest LTV. Like they're the most valuable customers or users or audience members. So, engaging with them, making sure that they feel valued and making sure the relationship is strong is super important. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the way HYBE has gone about this is they didn't see anything necessarily in the market that fit their strategy around building a community. So they built their own app. And currently it has over 6 million monthly active users. The actual registered users, I think, is over 100 million. I mean, it's a pretty high number. And they've started allowing third-party artists onto the platform. So, it's a really unique approach. And I think it speaks to, the dearth of tools, at least at the time when they created it, for artists to connect to their fans. I mean, streaming's done a lot of great things for the industry, but arguably has put kind of the user's listening experience necessarily ahead of the relationship with the artist and the fan. And HYBE is really focused on developing tools for that, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it makes tons of sense. And it is interesting to see all the different platforms and formats in which these community engagement activations emerge. We're seeing a lot on Discord is a big one. I mean, before that, Patreon, but and some communities that use Twitter kind of as a strong meeting place. But those brand specific ones, it'll be interesting to see how many of those get enough scale to last, because you really have to have critical mass for those to really be effective. All right, we're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, let's get a little specific about HYBE and what the prospects are there. We'll be right back.
Does your company belong at the center of the conversation about music, tech, and innovation? Listen, you should consider sponsoring the Music Tectonics Conference. It takes place in person October 25th through the 27th, 2022, in the Music Tech Hub of Los Angeles. Top-tier sponsorships are selling fast, but we still have a spot for you, whether your business is a hungry startup or an industry leader already. Every sponsorship level comes with an exhibitor booth at the Loews Santa Monica Beach Hotel on October 26th, the main conference hub for keynotes and panels. Your company will be at this epicenter of music, tech, and innovation throughout the event. That's just one perk of being a sponsor at Music Tectonics. You could be a guest on this podcast or even play a role in conference programming. Interested? Let's talk. Go to musictectonics.com to start the conversation with our contact form. And now, back to the show.
All right, we're back, and this has, like I said, been a great masterclass in just thinking about this concept of transmedia storytelling. And you used HYBE as your kind of case study to walk through this. How do you think all of this impacts HYBE's financial prospects and their future?
Yeah, so a lot's changed between when the piece was published in this conversation. So, I mean, in the piece I talk about their vision is very ambitious to create this, to realize this transmedia strategy that they're building towards. And, to date, they've been arguably very successful with it. Their revenue in 2018, I think was around 30-40 million. They've grown it to $1 billion in a very 5 years, and they've generated in 2021 58% of their revenue, so over $500 million from what they term indirect revenue sources. And that's up from 30% or around 100 million in 2018. And these indirect revenue sources are things transmedia related. So examples would be fan club subscriptions, video game sales. They're about to release NFTs, webtoons, educational materials. It's anything where the artist is not directly involved with the creation. And that's, to me, that's pretty amazing, right? That they've seen this kind of growth. That said, and we touch upon a lot of risks in the article, there's still a lot of risk. One of which kind of came to fruition recently with BTS taking the hiatus. It's this idea that they have BTS was incredibly strong IP, but they're still diversifying their IP portfolio, which will include organic. They've diversified it somewhat, but they need to continue diversifying it, which includes both organic, developing the artist in-house, but also through acquisition, the Ithaca acquisition, probably future acquisitions. We'll see, but probably. It also, some of the other risks is it's really hard. And when you're doing it at the scale that HYBE hopes to do it, and expensive, it's what, the biggest media companies in the world are trying to accomplish. And then, from the fact that HYBE is a public company, right, their prices, the value of the business is visible day to day. They have to navigate the public markets, and since the BTS announcement, the valuation's been cut in half, and so that's just going to be challenging. They're going to have to navigate being a public market company. So it's kind of a cop-out answer, but we'll see. I think they've built they've got a very strong structure in place to execute, and they've demonstrated that they can execute this transmedia strategy. The question really is, can they do it for a long period of time? Like, can they continue to grow at the extremely impressive rate they have? And that, the key thing, in my opinion, to maintaining, sustaining this growth is the content piece of that pyramid of the framework. That's where they really need to beef, in my opinion, they need to beef that up so that they can continue to leverage all the internal learnings and all the great tools and people they've built over time.
Well, and if they hadn't have been this transmedia company and they faced this issue with BTS taking a break, there would be very little to leverage. But since they're already in this mode of generating so much revenue from non-artist driven content creation, it's kind of a diversification of the risk, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think you can definitely make the argument that they're better off than they otherwise would have been if they didn't have any other revenue streams. I think we talk about this in the article. The challenge for them is, their valuation is at a premium, or was at a premium. The stock's been cut in half. At the time, the valuation was at a premium to other K-pop companies, other media companies, and it was partly driven by their high growth rate. And everything's relative. So I 100% agree with you. They're in a better position than they otherwise could be. But that growth rate, which was baked into the price, is at risk now.
Yeah.
And we'll see. But I mean, I'm excited to watch. Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a neat case study.
Yeah,
so sure. Unique and on the cutting edge of this stuff. I mean, you think about it. Any kind of label or studio that comes from a perspective where they have a concept for a band and they audition people for that band, and members of the band maybe cycle in and out, the traditional boy band, girl band, whatever you want to call it, is kind of, you kind of have a little more resources at your disposal as opposed to a real personality, charisma, individual, artist-driven band, where like, oh, the lead singer quit? Well, you're kind of screwed. It's a different band now, but
sure.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. So super cool insights. Glad to see that we can also kind of be part of the rolling out of this story on an ongoing basis post writing that article and having more kind of inputs to analyze. Just a couple more questions before you wrap up. What do you think other music brands, artists, and labels can learn from their approach? we've talked about that you haven't already discussed so far? I mean, you did get into some of that early on, just thinking about segmentation of market and fan and so forth. But what else do you think people can take away?
Yeah, no, I think so. First, I think one of the key things is that, if done successfully, there is a lot of financial reward, right, from executing the strategy. It's a way to capture more of your existing fans' attention, find new fans, engage your super fans, and monetize more often. I think, that should be taken with some of the risks we talked about. So if your ambitions are super high, it can take a lot of capital. It requires, a variety of skill sets, coordination, somewhat consistent new content to sustain that success. So it may not be the point is it may not be a fit necessarily for every artist or company done at a large scale. And then, to the point you just made, I think is super important. So like with the BTS announcement, I think it's fair to ask, is it unrealistic maybe that music IP can have the same longevity as some of these like, Marvel brands, Star Wars brands, right? Like these are real people who have changing motivations and desires. They're not just like an asset. So, that's something that if you're a label or even, an artist or a brand, you should acknowledge. And then for the majors, I think for the major labels who have, potentially very high ambitions, it's a way to differentiate in the market. I think if you're going to do it at scale, when you're pitching an artist who has visions of becoming, extremely popular. On the artist side, I think it's an interesting opportunity to be creative in new ways and in new mediums. Again, all the other things around financial reward and capturing more of your existing fans' attention, finding new fans, et cetera. But I think, again, as an artist, you should understand the potential costs of executing this transmedia strategy. And, it's while it allows you to generate content that doesn't require your time. We talked about BTS's indirect revenue. It is most likely going to require you to, if done at, BTS scale, put out more content. So, just worth thinking about that trade-off of your time as well and the demands. But yeah, no, I think those are some of the lessons learned here.
I love that as we're talking about this, I'm realizing that we have just transmediaized your article by having it on a podcast.
There we go. Let's go.
So those who don't read, certain generations that don't read or didn't come across it or whatever, or maybe they were reading something else when it came out and now they're listening to a podcast. So in that spirit, if anyone wants to learn more about transmedia storytelling, Jimmy and I will be doing twice a day Twitch streams about this forevermore. We're also going to be gaming on Stardew Valley together and discussing transmedia and Fortnite as well at the same time. And we're also releasing a fictional film about a new transmedia company.
Busy, right? Man.
Yeah.
We're busy.
Actually, none of that's true. Anyway, I like that we dove into this deeply. And I gave a little bit of your background, but before we totally wrap up, let's make sure to hit on this, because who the heck is this dude doing this research and writing this newsletter? What do you do on a day-to-day basis? And then after that, what can we expect from the Leveling Up Substack?
Yeah, I kind of wear two hats on a day-to-day basis. So at Alderbrook, we're a consulting firm. So we help with, I think you mentioned at the beginning, finance and strategy projects, help startups to public companies and everything in between. Can look like market research, can look like capital raise, can look like, making an investment in a company. So a variety of finance and strategy projects. We also make early stage investments in primarily media and media tech and software companies. And then from Leveling Up, it's kind of what we talked about at the beginning of the call, where, it's a way to learn in public. And, you can just expect, I'm going to try to release an article every month, primarily about media, startups, investing, anything else that catches my interest. And feel free to reach out. You can ping me on LinkedIn. Alderbrookcompanies.com has a form you can fill out, and subscribe to the blog on Substack, jimmystone.substack.com.
You got it. Yeah. And there's been a couple of recent articles back in April. Where do music catalog valuations go from here that our listeners might be interested in? A more recent one in June was, is blockchain gaming recession proof? Super interesting stuff. I'm so excited I came across you and that you took the time to join the podcast and talk to us about transmedia storytelling. Jimmy Stone, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Dimitri. Enjoyed it. See ya.
Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We have new episodes for you every week. Did you know? You can dig deeper into all our episodes with the show notes at musictectonics.com. While you're there, look for the latest about our annual conference, sign up for our newsletter to get updates, or get the Music Tectonics app for music tech news. Everything we do explores seismic shifts that shake up music and technology the way the Earth's tectonic plates cause quakes and make mountains. Connect with Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and find me, Dimitri Vitsa, if you can spell it, on LinkedIn. Bye-bye!
You're listening to Music Tectonics.